Hi, today I'm here with Jon Boeckenstedt, Vice Provost of Enrollment Management at Oregon State University. So much of the system appears to be broken. If you could look at the admissions process from scratch, do you have in your head what you dream it could look like?
I think the biggest problem is that, if there are, let's say, 1,600 four-year public and private universities that are, moderately selective or above, you have really 1,600 different ways of applying for admission. And that creates chaos, it creates confusion, it creates sort of different definitions of what admission actually is at one institution or another, or what an application is at one institution or another. And so I've campaigned for a long time for a centralized university admissions database where students would send all their transcripts, send the letters of recommendation, send test scores if they need test scores into one central spot, and then funnel them out to every college or university. And every college or university would report its statistics, its admissions decisions, its financial aid decisions back into that centralized location, so that researchers and other sorts of people who are interested in that sort of thing, including prospective students and their parents, could have access to that information and download it and see, really what their chances are. I think students have a right to understand and know that going forward. And I think what creates a lot of confusion and stress in the admissions process is that complete lack of transparency between and among colleges and universities when they talk about how they do admissions and what they do. And so a centralized database certainly wouldn't solve all of our problems, but I think better and clearer and more concise and more readily available information would be better for everybody, including the colleges and universities.
U.S. News and World Report college rankings. Is it important?
Well, it's important because it's important to people. Although, it's interesting because the research I've seen and the research I've conducted suggests that it's maybe important for 10 or 15% of parents and students. And those tend to be the ones who are most visible, highly educated, affluent, professional parents. And sometimes parents who are immigrants to America, because especially they're confused about the wide range and diversity of higher education institutions, and the idea that you can get a ranking about the best institution or the fifth best institution or which institutions are in the top 10, I think is really helpful to people who don't understand the landscape and don't understand the history. We in higher education love them when they speak well of us and sort of poo-poo them when, we're not included on their top list. Really, I think the only thing you need to know about college rankings is that one year Caltech came out #1 in the college rankings, in the U.S. News and World Report rankings, and sales of the magazine dropped dramatically. And so next year, Harvard was #1 again, and sales went up. So, in some sense, the rankings are inevitable because higher education doesn't do a really good job of talking about ourselves and evaluating ourselves. We're very nebulous about the benefits of higher education. And so it's very American that someone would take publicly available data and try to profit off of it, right? That's sort of the free enterprise system at work. On the other hand, I like to ask people what they like about their car, and they never say the horsepower or the turning radius or the miles per gallon. They'll talk about it, it feels good, or I like the way it fits, or when I'm driving down the road, it's smooth, and those are things that can't be quantified. And I think choosing a college is more often about things that can't be quantified than it is about hard linear statistics.
If we were to put aside that one list of rankings and you were to pick like the top 3 things you think families should consider, like graduation in 4 years, getting a job after, what would the things be that you would put on the list of pay attention to?
Well, I would say that's a great question. And I sort of want to say graduation rates are absolutely not the thing you want to look at, because you can predict graduation rates based on the input of the class. I have a blog post on higher ed data stories that talks about graduation rates are an input, not an output. And that's a hard thing for people to get their heads around.
Wait, can
But
you tell me what that means? I don't know what that means.
Yeah, it means if you look at one single variable, you can predict that college's 6-year graduation rate with about 90% accuracy.
What's the variable?
It's freshman SAT average scores. Yeah. And so, and if you think about the SAT as being a proxy for how white and Asian, how college educated, and how wealthy the incoming class is, it makes perfect sense, you know. And
So it's not because you're thinking that that test is so valuable.
For a single student, the SAT or ACT is essentially worthless in predicting anything of value for college admissions officers. And colleges have known this since the mid-60s. When they started doing research on it. I would say, you know, the important thing is, does that institution offer an academic program that fits with your interest and your temperament and your personality? Is it something, you know, is it a Sarah Lawrence, for instance, or is it an MIT, right? Two very fine institutions, but very different orientations toward education. It would be unlikely that many students would be equally happy at both of those places. I would say size is an important factor. And I would say a bunch of things that you would roll into climate, campus climate. Is it liberal or conservative? Are there a lot of fraternities and sororities or no fraternities and sororities? Is there a social consciousness that lines up with your values and your perspectives? Is there you know, an approach toward education that you find valuable? Some places don't have grades, for instance, and a lot of students love that idea and that concept. So, you know, it's really more the softer and the nebulous things. Do you want to be a big fish in a small pond or a small fish in a big pond? All of those temperament and personality issues come into play.
All right, so you mentioned finding out what the average score was on standardized tests would predict based on, because of who shows up with those scores typically. In terms of like the relative, well, I think relatively new test optional movement, it's been this kind of slow uptick, and COVID has really, you know, given us no choice because there wasn't any testing going on. So is that good for colleges?
Well, I think it'll be good for a lot of them. The whole public university system in the state of Oregon went test optional on the same day. And so we're all test optional and we're all permanently test optional. There are other places that have been having that discussion and just accelerated it. There are a few places like Caltech that went test blind, which means they won't even consider a test score if you send it. And then there are a whole bunch of places that have gone test optional out of necessity. They do it because they understand that, you know, maybe 25% of students will be lucky enough to have a test next year. And some of them have said it's only for 1 year. Some of them had said, we'll give it a try for 2 years. Some have said, we'll make it test optional and we'll evaluate it. And I think it's great. The first institution I led to test optional was DePaul in 2011. And the really interesting thing is that admissions officers sometimes fall into the trap of evaluating students on two scales, right? They're a 3.9 with a 1450. And when you don't have that shorthand anymore, it forces you to think about the quality of the student, the nuances, the texture, the subtleties in the application that help you understand that person as a person. And Cal Berkeley came out with a great statement about admissions, especially this year, given that the class was more diverse. And they said, we're looking for excellence. We're not looking for perfection. And I thought that was just an absolutely great way of looking at it. You're looking to make a class of interested and interesting students, not necessarily little robots who can get a 4.0 in every class. That's not what most campuses look for.
Does that make admissions officers' roles much, much more complicated?
Well, it means there's probably going to be a little more work in this year in creating next year's freshman class. And so, but who hasn't been displaced or inconvenienced by COVID-19? I think virtually everybody in the country has, and admissions is going to be no exception to that. So it'll be harder.
So if I'm looking at a large state school where the count is so tremendous, and having a GPA and a standardized test score allows you to just put in piles.
Yeah.
Uh, do you have to hire more admissions people now?
Well, it depends on. So, there are some institutions like UCLA and Berkeley that get 100,000 applications. And for them, I think the SAT probably was an important first sorting tool. But at a place like Oregon State, unless we get a lot more applications, we'll be fine because we've always given strongest weight to high school performance. And in fact, I'm of the age when I can remember that not every public institution in the country required SATs. And in fact, none of them did until the early 60s when Berkeley was the first to adopt the SAT requirement. It had always been a matter of, the state institutions trusted the state schools to deliver high school graduates who were qualified and capable of doing the work. And the SAT was never necessary. And I think people will find out right now in this year that it's not necessary to. And I think they will enjoy making admissions decisions without standardized tests. That's always been my experience, that admissions officers like test optional.
I remember someone telling me that people don't go into college admissions, to reject people.
That's right. That's right. And one of the things I like to tell students is, if you're in college admissions, it's because you generally like high school students, and they shouldn't feel afraid about finding their counselor online and dropping them an email and asking them a question. That's what admissions officers expect, and that's what they want, and that's what they love to do. Working with high school students and helping them realize the dream of college is why someone goes into college admissions in the first place.
I think that's so significant. When we started with the college process in my house, we felt like any communication was taboo. And then we
Right.
learned that actually it was welcomed. So that's a really important piece to put out there. And especially today, I would say, when everything is in turmoil and the uncertainty of life right now is overwhelming for teenagers and for their parents. So
Yeah.
what's your piece of advice? Like, let's say you have a senior right now. What is
Yeah.
your advice to parents?
Well, I've been telling parents to calm down for a long time. And I think that's just as important right now. One of the things people in colleges and universities tell me is that it's highly disruptive to have a parent running their high school student's life. And I understand parents think that they can't let this opportunity slip by, and they have to make sure the student squeezes every ounce of potential out of it. But it's really time to let the students manage and think for themselves. So there's that. Number two is realize that every generation has its moment and its defining sort of period, and I think for our high school seniors and juniors, COVID-19 will be that moment, the thing they remember the most. We can make this worse by adding a lot of stress and strain to it, or we can make it really an opportunity for students to grow and become better and pick up the slack and do the things they've never been able to do. And I hope that the latter happens. I hope this is a time when parents will allow their students to try some things, to make some mistakes, to learn from wrong decisions. My generation of admissions people started telling students that choosing a college was the most important decision they'd ever make. And if I could change one thing, I would have stopped admissions people from telling students that. It's not the most important decision they'll make, and it's not the most important decisions parents will ever oversee for their children. So, time to chill, folks.
Okay, give me one optimistic comment to leave with for parents of teenagers?
I would say you are going to, even though you don't think so, you are going to like the results with test optional college admissions.
Thank you so much, Jon Boeckenstedt, Vice Provost of Enrollment Management at Oregon State University.